Good morning, everyone, and welcome to our latest SHP webinar, our penultimate one, actually, of the autumn series. This one today is on loan working. It's entitled Loan Working, the Law and How to Comply, and I'm pleased to say it's in association with our friends at Solo Protect. So this session is broadcast by SHP. We're part of the Informa group, specifically Informa Connect. So my name's Mark Glover. I'm the editor of SHP, and I'll be chairing today's event. Before I come onto the topic a bit more and explain what we're going to be talking about and introduce our expert speakers, as ever, I've got a few points of housekeeping just to make sure you guys get the most from this webinar. So these are designed, as you know, to be interactive, and we really want to engage with you, the audience, on the topic, particularly today as well, which is a really interesting one. So below on your console, you should see a suite of widgets at the bottom of your screen. Here you'll be able to learn about our expert speakers that we've got on. You'll also be able to download some of resources as well. And I know we've got some toolkits and really practical resources for you that have been uploaded there from Solo Protect, so you can download those. Importantly, I guess we've also there's the Q&A widget, and that'll allow you to participate in the session by submitting questions through to us to the speakers. We've carved out about 10 minutes at the end to go through this, to go through some Q&A. So send them through, and we'll try and filter the questions through to our speakers towards the end of the session. We've also got polls, a couple of polls within the session as well, I think about halfway through. So do get involved with that as well, because that'll be really interesting temperature checks to sort of see what you guys are up to. And then we're going to talk around those results as well. So get involved with that. Also, after the session, there will be a full recording of this webinar, and this will be, I understand, emailed to you in the next couple of days. Also, I know it's important to you guys. There's a CPD certificate which you can also download from the webinar, as this is accredited. But make sure you do it before you log off today. Also, if you can, just carve out a couple of minutes at the end. There's a very small survey. It'd be great to just get your feedback on your experiences. It really helps us sort of guide and mold our content going forward, and hopefully we're hitting the mark of what you guys want as well. Lastly, but importantly, if you're having any technical problems such as sound or vision, then you can, again, in that Q&A box, just pop your query in there. We've got a couple of people behind the scenes who'll hopefully be able to sort out your sound or guide you to what you need to do to sort that out. So yeah, that Q&A widget is pretty important, I think, today for many things. So keep an eye on that. So yeah, that's the admin out of the way. And I think just circling back to today's topic, which is on loan working. Now, we cover loan working, a fair bit on SHP. Had a few webinars on the topic before, but I was saying to one of the speakers earlier that it really feels like an apt time to be talking about it again. And I think also the very angle that we're going with here about the legislation and the regulation, which sometimes can be a little bit ambiguous, or it hasn't got as much spotlight on as other areas do. So we're going to be sort of really adding some clarity around that, which I think is important. But more generally, perhaps more philosophically, I think loan working over the last couple of months or so, I think there's more emphasis placed now on people are thinking more about their employees, particularly in sort of more more extreme environments. We've seen, sadly, some of the riots that took place a couple of months ago with shop fronts being attacked. And I think more the society we might be heading in, that this is more and more appropriate now. So I think it's a good time to be having this conversation, and also just to, as I said, to make you more aware of the legislation and regulation around what you really should be doing. And what this webinar is going to aim to do is give you some sort of practical tips around how to implement that. So we'll talk about some of the legal challenges that you've got, but also how can you keep on top of that? How can you stay ahead of the compliance curve? So some really good, as I say, practical tips on how to implement risk assessments, safety policies, spotting hazards, etc. So a lot to squeeze in the next hour or so. But to help us do that, I'm really pleased to say we've got some expert speakers to help us out. First, I'm pleased to say is Steve Howe. Steve is the CEO at Managing Director at Solo Protect. And good morning, Steve. How are you? Thanks for joining us. Thanks for joining with us today.
Good morning, Mark. Yeah, no, it's great. It's a pleasure to be here. Yeah, doing really well, thank you. Looking forward to getting into some discussion today on our topics.
Sure. And Steve, just very quickly, I know it's difficult to sort of squeeze in, but what are you seeing? What's your role basically, and what you've been doing in your time at Solo Protect?
Sure. I think to give people a bit of sort of my background without spending any length of time on it, I worked for Solo Protect for the last 8 years. So I joined originally in the beginning as operations director, looking at all of our service and operational efficiencies and the types of sort of devices that we operate with. And more recently, over the last 3 years, I've assumed the role of managing director of the business. And I guess my background, there's a common theme through the roles that I've done over my career, which is around delivering service to customers who are in distress in some way. Now, whether that's through my time in the banking industry, please don't hold that against me. I was a personal banking associate at one stage. But that was dealing with people's financial problems that they were having trouble with. And then I moved into a different industry, roadside breakdowns. So I was actually in there for around 16 years. So that's obviously people in very difficult, distressing and dangerous situations at roadside. And I worked in the automotive industry as well. Somewhat different, dealing with customers' complaints about their vehicles that are manufactured. But more latterly, turning all of that, I guess, experience over into the last 8 years into the lone working industry, which again is having people, in really dangerous or distressing situations and working out, how we deliver service to those people. And my role at Solo Protect is to ensure our customers get the very best service for their lone working and home working staff. It's also to support customers in managing and mitigating their risks of varying degrees, leading our service and sales teams to provide the very best end-to-end solutions to customers and prospective customers. And obviously, it's a very dynamic world, as you've just been describing out there as risks change. And really to sort of lead and spearhead our mission to make working alone particularly safer for everybody.
Good stuff. Thanks, Steve. Thanks for coming on. I'm looking forward to getting into the topic with you today. And there also are I'm very pleased to say our other expert on the call is Bridget Green, who is consultant, legal console and fractional head of people at Legal Edge. Good morning, Bridget. Thanks for joining us. Do you mind just sort of telling us a bit about your background and what you hope to get out of the discussion today?
Morning, Mark. Pleasure to be here. And of course, so I am by trade a commercial lawyer. I've worked almost predominantly in e-coms and retail, so in-house. And over the years, I've sort of morphed into also a head of people because of the number of sort of people claims that I've dealt with over the years. Currently, I'm working with a business called Legal Edge as their fractional head of people and legal counsel. And together with them, we help scaling companies to grow by sort of identifying risks that really matter, prioritizing them, and helping them align their legal and people strategies with their business growth plans. So all of those things touch, to some extent on the health and safety issues and bringing in practical strategies for businesses to help meet those risks.
Brilliant. Thanks, Chris. Good to have you on. And also, you'll be helping us a little bit with touching on those legal areas that we're going to be talking about. So thanks for coming on. Excellent. Right, I'm going to hand back to Steve, who's going to give us just a bit of an overview of lone working. Always important just to get a bit of a foundation of what we're talking about. So Steve, over to you, and I'll just move it on to that slide for the agenda.
Perfect. Okay, so what we wanted to just walk through today, there's various discussion points that we'll be getting into. But first of all, we'll just be sort of providing context on what is lone working and why the focus on lone working demands special attention. We'll touch on the changing landscape of lone worker safety and the reasons for that, largely things like post-COVID remote working, the rising violence. Mark and I were talking just before we started in terms of more recent events with riots, etc. And obviously the increasing number of public safety incidents that are prevalent in the press. And then we're going to move into, rather than just presenting content, we're going to move into some discussion points between us all on 3 topics. One is the legal implications and responsibilities that an employer has. So employer duties, risk assessments and why you have to do those, and the consequences of non-compliance in covering those items. We'll also focus on proactive risk management, communication and ongoing safety training as part of the sort of best practice for risk assessments and safety policies. And then obviously what everyone will be really focused on is it's always changing. So what future legal changes are coming and how to stay ahead of those. So that's sort of the agenda that we'll be working through over the next sort of 40 minutes or so. Probably really important, though, to start with what is a lone worker. And I apologise to those of you that are on the call that already know this stuff, but I thought, again, just interesting and useful to set some context around lone working. And so, you know, the government website describes a lone worker as a person who undertakes specific activity unaccompanied or without immediate access to another person for assistance. If you look at the health and safety executive definition, it's very similar. It's around, you know, those people that work by themselves without close or direct supervision. So, you know, when you look at lone workers, it's not around individuals perhaps experiencing brief situations they find themselves working alone, but where individuals are knowingly placed in circumstances where they work on their own without supervision or immediate access to other people. And actually, from our experience, certainly at Solo Protect, we operate in Europe as well. Looking at other, you know, it's common language, basically. We operate directly in France, the Netherlands and Germany. And actually, each of those countries have very, very similar definitions in their own in-country health and safety regulations. So it's a very common definition. So who are lone workers? Well, the really obvious examples that everyone will recognise and bring up most of the time are things like health visitors. It's pretty obvious, you know, community nurses going in to see patients in their own homes. They're on their own. They're representing their company, in that case, the NHS. But it can be, you know, surveyors and estate agents. I'm sure many people on the call will know the very famous case of Susie Lamplugh, for example, who was an estate agent who was meeting someone she didn't know to show a home. And if you don't know that scenario, I would definitely encourage you to go to the Susie Lamplugh Trust website and have a look at Susie's story, because it's unfortunately a very typical story of things that happen. But also you've got you know, surveyors, anyone going out to meet a member of the public on their own. Delivery drivers even, you know, that's become very prevalent, more prevalent since COVID. And so those people are not only on the road on their own, driving, but they're also meeting individual members of the public, delivering goods to people's homes. This can be cleaners, you know, as an example, whether that's commercial premises that they're working in, or individual, you know, people's homes. Gardeners and groundskeepers, and some engineers that work specifically on their own, going out to sites. So these are the more obvious ones, and there's many more examples of those. But what about the less obvious roles that don't come to mind straight away? Well, you know, many organisations have the misconception that a lone worker is someone who works by themselves all the time. But it can be someone who is not in eyesight or earshot of a colleague at any point during their working day or shift. So ultimately, if an employee can't be seen or heard by another colleague, then they are working on their own with no direct supervision. And so you do have things, you know, post-COVID particularly, what we have found is when people have moved to home working, where they were previously in an office surrounded by all of their colleagues, they are now in a situation where they are home working, they're a remote worker or a lone worker. There are people that travel for work. So I'm sure there's many people on the call who have field-based sales teams who are driving the length and breadth of the country at times and going to meet sometimes prospects, people they don't know, but they're out there driving on their own, perhaps with no oversight. They are also lone workers. I think another less obvious one, and we've certainly looked at this in our own organisation, are those people who stay behind to work late routinely, or coming to work early and they're the first person in work for the first hour or two of the day. Those people are also lone workers, possibly less risky in terms of the work that they do. But again, there is a window there where they may need some assistance. And I'll cover actually an example within our own organisation to bring that to life a little bit later. There are also people, you can be in the midst of many people, all of the public, but you're still a lone worker. So people who work on large events, concerts or conferences, if they're not in eyesight or earshot of someone else that they work with, then they are working essentially on their own. And that is equally the same for people like retail. People who work in retail, they may be the only worker on the shop floor at that particular point in time. Therefore, they are a lone worker at that point, working with other members of the public. And as it says there, shopping centres, airports and schools. So you can be surrounded by lots of people, but actually from a worker and an employer perspective, you still have lone workers operating. And then those people working on large sites such as construction sites or warehouses, we certainly saw an uptake in interest during COVID as people needed to keep their operations running and therefore had to work with more skeleton staff as social distancing was a requirement. And so they kept people working, but obviously there were less people in those warehouses or large site areas. And so they, by definition, have more lone workers. So those are who lone workers can be, but why focus on lone workers? Why do you need to do that? Well, lone workers face increased, quite unique risks when they're on their own, such as medical emergencies, violent incidents or accidents where they don't have access to immediate support. And unlike team environments, lone workers don't always have colleagues nearby to pick up on that and to assist them in emergencies. So the other side of this is the rise in remote work. Post-COVID, more workers are operating remotely or alone, making proactive safety measures really crucial. And one of the examples I would give here, just a real life example within my own organisation over that time, and if you'll indulge me while I give you the scenario, myself and one of my team were always the first people in on our top floor, and we both worked at opposite ends of a large office. So we're working, head down behind our desks, and I'm really fortunate. Very fortunate that the site that we work in, because of the nature of the work that we do, is fully CCTV monitored because we're a highly secure site. And so I actually got a call from my alarm centre saying, you might want to go and check on this person because they look like they're not well. And lo and behold, I run down to the bottom of the office and my team member is having a seizure. Super quietly, just slumped over their desk. No one could see apart from my alarm receiving centre. Now, not everyone is in a privileged position where they work in a CCTV controlled environment. And so we were able to get first aid to that individual and also the emergency services. But what really changed with that when we did our risk assessments, when we started moving people more to home working, was that it was then known for that individual that because they were susceptible to that type of medical issue, or they were suffering with that issue, when we moved them to home working, part of the risk assessment was, does your partner stay at home with you all the time? No, out at work all the time. Okay, so you're going to be completely on your own and have no oversight, no one to call immediately should you have an incident. And so what we did, because again, we work in that type of industry and business, part of our solution was to give that individual a lone working device so that if they were incapacitated or if they felt unwell, they could push the button and call for assistance. So it's those practical things, but I think the takeout from that one was very much about the fact that we needed to consider that person's working environment was changing, and therefore what were their unique circumstances that we needed to take into consideration. So as an employer, we have a responsibility to make sure that we're fulfilling duty of care to our teams and our people, to make sure that we're reducing risk, but also in doing that, we can improve employee well-being, including things like candidate attraction, business reputation, a good organisation to work for, and staff loyalty and staff turnover. But addressing lone worker safety helps avoid, this is more the dry part of the subject, but this is something that everyone always asks. It helps to avoid things like legal penalties and keeps the business compliant with safety regulations, because there are obviously repercussions of not being compliant with the legislation. So just looking at the changing landscape of lone worker safety, we now work in a post-COVID world, obviously, but the pandemic significantly reshaped the working environment. And we see that with our customers all the time. More lone and remote workers as a result, and the duty of care still applies. So risk assessments that employers do still need to be adapted, as per my the example I just used, to include remote working environments. And the rise of remote working has introduced new safety challenges. So with people working from home, they don't have that immediate support of colleagues or supervisors. Or also in the field, they may just have more sparsely populated workforces. So the lack of face-to-face interaction can really make it quite difficult to identify stress, burnout, or physical or medical safety risks. And as we were mentioning earlier, the recent unrest in various cities has led to a spike in violent incidents, riots, and attacks on both employees and businesses. And there are sectors that really suffer with that. Retail and service workers working alone in isolated settings become increasingly at risk of encountering things like violence and theft, all related. And in conjunction with that, obviously, you see these reports in the press all the time as well. The increase in attacks on public transport is becoming a growing concern, particularly for workers commuting late at night or early in the morning. And what we hear a lot more recently is that employees, especially lone and high-risk workers, obviously feel the need to feel safe during their commute, but it's becoming more of an expectation that as an employer, we are helping them to manage that risk. And I know that, I'm sure Bridget and I will talk a little bit about that later in terms of where the responsibility lies, but it can be a grey area, and there are some best practice tips that we can probably offer to say how you should consider that. But it is becoming an increasingly expected requirement from workers as they start to talk to you about working for your organisation. So the landscape is rapidly changing, it's very dynamic, and with those risks in mind, it does require employers to think about how they protect their lone and high-risk workers through all sorts of different methods. That can be safety training, policies, risk assessments, safety protocols, integrating technological solutions into your processes to make sure that you do what you need to do in a measured way to keep pace with the evolving risks. I'll hand over to Bridget now at that point.
Yes, so this slide here sets out all of the relevant legislation that you need to consider. I'm not going to run through all of these in turn because that would be immensely boring. However, the key thing to remember here is that there is no specific law that deals solely with lone workers. Your obligations as an employer to your workers is the same wherever they're based. So if they're in the office, if they're on a shop floor, whether they're by themselves, working from home, etc. And that obligation, you have a duty of care to ensure their safety. And it involves you conducting risk assessments before they commence working, taking reasonable steps to mitigate foreseeable risks. So this is the bit that I find employers struggle with the most is what is reasonable, what is my expectation? And is often the case with the law, it's not as prescribed as you might wish it to be. It is there for you to assess as an employer what the risks are and take reasonable steps. So to break that down a little bit, the sorts of things you can take into account when considering what is reasonable is the size of your business, the nature of the risks, the cost implications, whether there are alternatives that are easily achievable in terms of people's working patterns, etc. And then looking at the obligation to mitigate risk, it is not an obligation to eliminate risk. There is version of events where all employers can be responsible for eliminating all risks that their lone workers face. What you need to be able to do is to demonstrate that you have thought about it, put processes and procedures in place to lessen those risks where you can. And the risks themselves need to be foreseeable. So it is not all risk, you can't gaze into your crystal balls and predict everything, but there are risks that are more likely given the nature of the work that the employees do. And I'll come on to this a bit later, but one of the things you might think about is how you engage with your employees to understand what risks they see in their daily lives, in their daily working lives, that you may not already be aware of. The other point I wanted to make was that when thinking about who this applies to, I see employers often forgetting about consultants. So you should remember that it's not just your employees that this duty of care is owed to, it's anybody that you as a business hire to do work for you. So even if even if a worker is a self-employed consultant, you owe them the same obligation as you do to your employees. So one thing, again, that I see people missing a bit is sort of the assumption that it's all on the shoulders of you as an employer to manage risk. But you must remember that there is also an obligation on the employees to inform you of anything that could increase their level of risk. So that can be pre-existing health conditions that Steve touched on earlier. It can be, I don't know, they work in a factory and there's been a great big spill. It's incumbent on them to let you know so that you can take necessary precautions. And the best way to do that is to engage, to ensure that you've got sort of proper engagement processes in place. So asking the questions about whether they have pre-existing conditions, keeping in touch with them, checking in with them, etc. A note of caution slightly on the medical conditions piece. Do be aware of your obligations under data privacy laws. So I've seen HR teams do this before, go out and ask people to disclose information about, say, their mental health, that may put them at greater risk if they're working on their own, or medical conditions regarding how they should set up their ergonomic chairs at work, at home, etc. And then they haven't thought about the fact that they're collecting sensitive personal data and that there are some significant regulations in place that they need to bear in mind about how they use, store and retain that data. So just a word of warning on that one. We touched briefly on what the legal implications of failing to comply with the various legislations are. In short, it's two things. The most likely is a fine. In extreme circumstances only, you can see directors of businesses get prison sentences. I personally am not aware of a single case of a director of a company being sent to prison because of a sort of an injury that was sustained by a lone worker, but it's definitely important to bear that in mind. And to give you some sort of examples of the sort of situations, more serious situations that you see come up. There was, for instance, a lone worker who was carrying out drainage work, and he was by himself, and he sustained fatal injuries doing that work when I think he fell in a trench and equipment and soil landed on him. And the company was fined £30,000 because they had not put in place sufficient safety protocols. They didn't have a way for him to communicate that he was in an emergency situation. And as a result, they received a fine. Another example is actually really quite a nasty one, where a Brent council was fined £100,000 because one of their social workers was attacked when she was on a home visit. She wasn't, in fact, by herself. She was with a member of staff, but the basis is still the same, whether they were lone workers or with somebody else. She hadn't received any sort of training, risk assessment. She hadn't been shown how to de-escalate situations of violence, etc. And as a result, Brent Council was fined quite significantly. From my personal experience, I'm more, as I said, I'm an in-house lawyer and HR professional. And high risk in a sort of a softer way. So a prime example I encountered was during COVID. I had, in a retail setting, a member of staff who was expected, I'd say the implication was that she was expected to continue working during COVID. And she felt that in order to do so, she needed specific equipment from the office. So she took it upon herself to travel to the office during lockdown and collect some quite heavy equipment and then use that equipment at home. She then later claimed that equipment and working from home caused her some significant back issues, and she wanted to raise it legally with the business in order for them to sort of contribute financially to her recuperation. And those are the sort of situations that, as a lawyer and a head of people, I come up against most often in terms of whether you as a business have really fulfilled your duties to an individual and whether they themselves have fulfilled their duties. In this case, she had a pre-existing condition that she hadn't informed people of. She took it on herself to get potentially non-essential equipment. And what you end up is in a bit of a sort of a legal back and forth to come to a mutually sort of beneficial agreement as to how to manage it. So those are the sort of the day-to-day examples that you would come across. I'm not gonna carry on too much more about the legal background. That is the key to remember, that you have to take reasonable steps for foreseeable risks, and your duty is to mitigate, not to eliminate.
Good stuff. Thanks, Bridget. I think you've covered off some really good points there, and in fact, and also great to see so many questions coming in as well, which is really good from you guys. It's obviously a really a topic that's chiming, which is great. I think we're going to, Bridget's covered really so well sort of some of the legal implications and responsibilities there, and I think as well citing some case studies also. I think we were gonna touch on that, but I think we'll just move on. Perhaps, guys, I was wondering, go straight to the poll question, actually, if that's all right with Steve and Bridget, just to see to see what people are doing out there. So this poll question, as I said, guys, you can this is interactive, so you can respond to this. The poll question is simply, do your risk assessments specifically address the needs of lone, remote and high risk workers? So you've got about 30 seconds or so, I've been told by my colleagues, for you to do that. So if you just want to just answer that. Whilst you do, Steve, sorry, I just wanted to ask something that's just popped up, actually, that how the impact of, I know COVID was a long time ago, but gosh, what a shift that has been for the lone working sector. Does it still sort of, I mean, it's now, part of what we're doing, but at the time that must have been a real significant moment when it dawned on you, hang on, there's going to be more emphasis now.
Yeah, I mean, it was a very confusing time for most people at that time. And I think one thing that, we considered was that, yes, there was a lockdown, but people were still going to need to try to run their businesses. So, our view was there are going to be a lot more lone workers because people are going to have to operate with more skeleton staff, and obviously there's higher risk. So, and that actually borne out to be really true. We had lots of approaches and inquiries from customers, existing customers, saying, I might need to do something slightly different. And also lots and lots of new customers saying, I need to carry on operating. So I need something that means that I don't have to, supervise my staff. I can't in many ways.
Yeah.
So we saw a real influx at that point of inquiries on lone working. And the thing is, it's actually carried on being sustained over time, because I think also people have found that they've run their businesses a little bit more productively in some ways. They've stuck with that process, so to speak, as well, moving forward.
Yeah. Yeah, cool. Yeah, well, I can say it's a good thing, but it has shifted things along, which is really good.
Yeah.
I sort of failed in my duty as a host there, but I forgot to give you the questions, which you can see on the screen. But hopefully that's given you time, guys, to answer it. So we'll just click through and see what the results are. Oh, So only a small amount, that's interesting. Only a small amount no, say that we have to plan to address these soon. Yes, but we need to update or improve them. And yes, we have risk assessment. So it's sort of half and half there, guys, isn't it? Do you want to add anything to those things there, Steve? Encouraging?
Yeah, I think for me, I don't think it's necessarily a big surprise. I think, you know, even my own organisation, as we started to adapt and started to move people more towards home working, for example, you know, we knew that we needed to broaden our risk assessment to consider other things, even to the point of people, you know, coming into work. That wasn't necessarily our obligation, but because we were aware morally to a degree of someone that was coming in a particular route that we were not comfortable with, we wanted to include that in our risk assessment for that individual. So it doesn't surprise me, but you need to take the time to stop and really consider. It just needs thinking time, really. That's the thing. Everyone's really busy, and so it's hard to sometimes stop and go, I need to really sit down with my team and with individuals and really ask the questions. What situations are you facing, as Bridget was talking about earlier, actually. So it's not an entirely unsurprising result.
Okay. And any thoughts,
Bridget? Just to add to that. Yeah, sorry, Mark. To add to that, I'd say that you know, as an employer, your obligation is to consider these risk assessments and processes as sort of live. So what I see a lot is leaders sort of doing an initial risk assessment, ticking the box, moving on, and not considering changes in how things go. And I think the point is that around that employee engagement piece. So if it's not refreshing your risk assessment specifically, you can consider, for instance, sort of staff engagement surveys and polls and pulse surveys, etc., to sort of garner information from your staff to ensure that you are covering off those risks. And it's quite a nice way, if you do get a claim in or risks are raised, of sort of showing that you are taking reasonable steps that are not sort of hugely costly or too difficult to implement, but that you've got it in mind.
Brilliant. Thanks, guys, and thanks everyone for joining us. There's another one a bit later on as well, which we'll come on to. One of the questions I wanted to ask, actually, and you guys have sort of touched on it, was around, and I'll start with Bridget if I may, but just around, circling back a bit, but just around commuting and employees to commuting. And it's, again, something that's happened sort of post-COVID. We're doing it more now, and it can be a bit of a grey area. If you're an employer, how far does that employer's responsibility extend? Because it does seem really, really woolly in an employee's commute, especially as Steve mentioned, when you're working late or travelling home late. So what's the sort of responsibility there?
Well, unfortunately, as I said before, the legislation doesn't spell out in great detail what your responsibility is. So arguably, this falls into a sort of a bit of a grey area. And I think the way to sort of approach how you would deal with it is how you communicate with your staff. So in circumstances where, for instance, you're asking your staff to stay late, or they need to stay late to complete a project, are you then thinking about how they're going to get home from the office or to the tube from, late at night, potentially by themselves? Really practical, simple things you can do is tell them to go home and do their work from there, or make sure that HR are sending out regular communications, reminding them that they need to, if possible, go to the tube with a colleague and take reasonable steps to protect themselves. What you'll often see is HR teams sending around sort of messages sporadically to say, actually, you know what, we've heard that there's an increase in pickpocketing in the area. Please take care of yourself. Please make sure, etc. Those would largely be enough to meet your obligations during the commuting phase. Where it may differ is if, for instance, you touched on riots or COVID or something extreme like that, then that's when you really need to click in as an employer and think, actually, the risks are now so significant that we need to perhaps take a different approach and ensure that everybody that can work from home is. Perhaps we organise transportation for our employees, etc. And one other that comes up a lot, actually, and again is often overlooked, is staff socials. So, where you've got a Christmas party, it's a bit of a 3-line whip. Everybody's supposed to attend. You ply all your staff with loads of alcohol and then sort of let them go on their way. I mean, the number of HR-related incidents I've had to deal with, after a staff Christmas party is a lot. And truthfully, very few of the staff that are involved in those then come back and say, well, it was all your fault because you got me drunk and I had to come to the party. But it's not beyond the realms. And I think in an increasingly litigious environment, it's something that we should be aware of. So again, sort of warnings, reminders from HR on how to manage your own safety, but also thinking about potentially providing transport back, those sorts of sensible, common sense approaches would be enough to meet your obligation.
Thanks,
Mark,
Bridget.
Just on a slight tangent, actually, leading off from what Bridget was saying, I think another example, it's kind of commuting related, but it's not particularly, a staff member going home. Just sort of related to that, if we have members of our team that are going out on company business, they may be setting up an event or something for the business, and that requires an overnight stay. And we do this fairly often. I would give an example of perhaps a female member of the team where we knew that they're going to stay at a hotel overnight, but they're on our business. Now, are they on our time? Possibly not. Once the work is done, but actually they're outside of their normal routine. They're away from home. But the stance that we take is that anyone in that situation has some form of protection or safety support. So we issue, whether it's an app or a device, to those individuals, because even for us, just morally, they're out of their normal routine, out of their normal evening environment. We're on company business. Therefore, we want to make sure that whatever happens, they've got some level of protection. So it's slightly different from commuting, but it's someone who's away from home or traveling somewhere else. And that can equally be for men as women. We're not differentiating, but typically we tend to find that, if someone's attracting unwanted attention, that's a really difficult situation to be in without any support.
100%. No, I think that's really relevant. That's kind of why I wanted to just sort of touch on it again, that it's more just so important. You touched on Susie Lamplugh earlier as well, which was such a long time ago. It's still essentially the same thing. But now with more commuting law, people are working late more, people are traveling alone more. So I think it's really important. So thanks, guys. I wanted to, if we can, just sort of touch back on risk assessments and talking about the sort of more practical side of it. Best practices for risk assessments and safety procedures off the back of this poll, actually, that we've seen. Steve, if you don't mind, I'll come back to you again. What best practices should employers, if you can pick a couple, should employers follow when conducting risk assessments for the entire workforce, including lone workers and home-based staff? There's a lot to think about there, isn't there?
There really is, and I think what we tend to find when we talk to people, if we're at conference events and things like that, it can just feel really overwhelming. Where do I start? It's like you just said, it's massive. I've got to think about this group of people, home working, field-based workers. The main point would be just start with something. Just even if it's your first survey with your staff. I think that we've provided a resource in terms of a template, risk assessment template that anyone can have access to. And that just gives you a starting point to sort of ease your way in, or to even look and compare it against the one that you have today. But I think a lot of the time it's about, as Bridget talked about earlier, engaging with staff. The people that know the risks they face the best are the people doing the job that are facing those risks all the time. The value is in the conversation because, as an employer, you might be talking to that person and they give you the obvious risks, but you are then able to take it further and say, well, what about if you're in that situation? Do you face that all the time? It's the value of that conversation, which is where you start to get the individual's unique situation coming out, and you can actually really start to put that in your documentation. When we're looking at it, when we do it ourselves and with our customers, we sort of define, once we've got a risk assessment together, the risks into two broad definitions. One is social risk, so verbal aggression, verbal threats, physical aggression, physical assault, and then environmental, we call it, but it's basically slips, trips and falls. You'll have some people that will be susceptible or in a position of both, and you'll have some people that don't have the social risk, but they might work in a warehouse where they've got slips, trips and falls as their main one. One thing that we do through our templating, and we use obviously internally, is you can have a lot of risks in there. Actually, it's about looking and saying, how often do you face that risk? how likely is it to happen? You know, it's about this reasonable approach to foreseeing what might happen and then putting the relevant solutions in place. So it's not about covering absolutely everything, because you're not going to capture everything in reality. It's about having that measured conversation so you can start to manage, you know, the highest risks first.
Could I just add to that, from a legal perspective? From a legal perspective, one thing that I see employers often falling down on is the obligation is to conduct your risk assessments before an employer joins or moves into an environment perhaps where they're alone working. I don't know about everybody on this call, but I don't think I've ever received my risk assessment before I joined a company. It's always sort of about a month in, or, you know, later down the line. So that's one really sort of practical thing to bear in mind. You should be doing this right at the outset, because obviously then you have a period of time where you're at full risk, you've not done your risk assessment, but they're doing the job.
Sure, thanks, Guy. I think it's a really good point. Also, Steve, you said about you know, just engaging with your workers and sort of getting them involved, and that helps with the culture, but I also think they're at the front line. They are going to be your real eyes and ears around this as well. I think another important element around the implementation, the best practice, is training and communication, which I touched on. So it's one thing to create a comprehensive risk assessment, which we can do, but as I sort of alluded to, how do you ensure that people comply? And you know, you just said, Bridget, you didn't get it until, so how much importance should I place on this? How can you ensure, how can you engage that staff are aware of and comply with safety policies and procedures? And Bridget, I'll ask you initially, if that's okay.
Yeah, so it's a really good question, because what you see a lot of companies, especially smaller companies that are in sort of lower risk industries, they tend to plonk on a generic health and safety policy onto their website, put a few URLs on, and then think, job done. But your obligations do go further than that. You are obliged to implement clear communication and regular training. Now, again, it's not hugely spelled out in the law what that entails. It does have to be taken, you do have to consider what risks are actually relevant to you as a business and go from there. But for instance, if you work in an office-based environment where most people work hybrid or from the office, but you've got a handful of lone workers, then you can target your training very specifically to those individuals. It doesn't have to be hugely costly. There are lots of great resources that you can find on the HSE website, for instance, and your obligation really is to make sure that they watch it, see it, engage with it. You can do that during, you know, HR training sessions. It doesn't have to be spending loads of money on external people to come in and all these things. And then obviously, if you're at the other end of the spectrum and you're very high risk, then, you know, it's absolutely incumbent on you to be doing that training regularly and keeping really good records of it, and putting sufficient budget to it. So again, unfortunately, the law's not hugely helpful here, in that it doesn't spell it out. It is something for each business to sort of consider on its own merits for them.
Mark, can I just jump in on that as well? That's a really useful and important point. One thing, again, we're in a very privileged position because we hear, you know, I can sit in our alarm receiving centre and hear these events happening live. I wish, and I don't wish, that I could play a real call, because there is nothing more sobering than actually, you know, we're talking about risk assessments, but actually hearing something happening totally brings it to life. And of course, not everyone has access to that. But one of the things that, you know, I think about a specific example that I sat in and heard the call come in, the alarm, and, you know, we were listening, as we do, to an individual, and it was obvious that they had their training for de-escalation. So they were in a very difficult, threatening situation, not violent at the beginning, but they were you could hear them trying to talk their customer down from you know, the accusations they were throwing at them. You could hear them sequentially trying to de-escalate, to calm the situation down. Now, in that instance, the individual blocked their exit. Even though they'd done all their training, they positioned themselves close to an exit because they anticipated that it was going to be quite difficult. That was part of their policy, part of their training. So they were doing all the right things. But in this instance, the training, you know, it calmed it to a point, but then it all blew up again because the individual was being completely unreasonable. in this instance, I'm not going to go into it because it's quite triggering actually, but the individual chased that end user down to their car and then caught them and started slamming their leg in the door because they were so angry with them. So you've got all these different parts of it which could have been de-escalated through training. Training is a great thing to do. As Bridget said, there's lots of resources. Susie Lampley also have de-escalation training and harassment training. They're really good. But you need that high risk piece is really useful to consider. You might need a couple of solutions for some people. You might need just basic training for others. That risk assessment will help you to understand what situations they're facing and what level of support you do need to put in for them.
That's great. Thanks for sharing, Steve. That's really important, I think, to get across. So some really good advice there on risk assessments. We've had a couple of questions. So this has just flown by so far. I'm really enjoying this webinar. I've had so many questions that have come in. We're getting some really great debate from our speakers as well. We've got a poll we've got to do in a minute. I'm annoyed we've only got about 10 minutes left, but we'll try and keep going. Some of the questions we've been getting in have been around technology and how to implement that and what that involves. And actually, Steve, if I can ask, in terms of risk assessment, a risk assessment strategy for a company, can you explain how these technologies, such as safety devices, can help rather than just, oh, I need to do this? How can it really be part of that strategy? How can they be part of that strategy?
Yeah, I mean, you can go right back to the beginning and talk about your lone worker policy. Policies are really important, and I think, again, as Bridget said, you can pull a policy off from somewhere that's very generic, and that'll tick a box. But actually, if you do give some proper consideration, it really helps people to understand. This is about cultural change sometimes. If people understand and you can spell out for them, what does it mean to be a lone worker? What examples are there of lone working? What examples are there of the risks that are present and you could face? It starts to bring it into reality for people. When we talk about technological solutions, things to be considered are, do you need a discrete device so that, the worst thing in the world is, sometimes picking up a phone because the aggressor might think that you're trying to call for help, and that makes the situation worse. So again, your risk assessment will help you to understand the environment that your worker is working in and what the right solution might be. But I think even for lone workers, knowing it can promote a sense of confidence and reassurance if they do have a way of being able to call for help discreetly. So with the technological solution, I can only speak about our own, being able to push a panic button, if you call it that, and our device will then just vibrate lightly against the individual. So they know, right, I'm being monitored. I know that the support is there. I know that this can be escalated if my training doesn't work or the situation gets out of hand. And I know that support will come quicker than, in most cases, a 999 call. What that will do, it can take the panic out of the situation for people as well, knowing that they've got some backup straight away if they need it. I think in terms of, I've seen a question coming actually around how do you enforce the use of lone working devices? And I think there's two things with that. One is, yes, having your policy and being very clear with people what they have to do. That's one thing. There's definitely a hearts and minds piece around it as well, which is helping people to understand the value, the support, the benefit that it will bring in terms of their working day and their well-being. But ultimately, if you identify real risks that you need to try to mitigate, the best examples that I've seen in our customers who've got very high usage of lone working solutions are where they've embedded it within their management group, and it becomes just part of your regular one-to-one performance management review. So alongside your productivity statistics, you've got your lone working statistics. I can see that you're using the solution. I can see that you're performing check-ins and you're moving around and you're doing all the things that we're asking you to do. Really great job. Versus, I can see, this would be through our own portal that people have access to. I can see you haven't even switched your device on in the last month, but you're still going out and working in these situations. That's not an acceptable place for us to be working from. And so, we have a duty of care. They have a responsibility. It's about visibility of the detail so you can have a meaningful conversation to encourage, or sometimes, and we've seen customers do this, to take it more formally with people, to say it's not acceptable that you're not using the solution that we've put in place, because that's your safety and it's our obligation to make sure that you are safe at all times. So there's varying different degrees, but I think it starts with those policies all the way through to making sure you're talking to people regularly and showing them their statistics as well.
Brilliant, thank you. And I think we've got our next poll is really, which will be really interesting after Steve just touched on that so well. We've got a poll on for you guys to answer. Do you use safety devices or apps to protect your lone, remote and high-risk workers? And I will make sure I click through to the options for you to answer. So A, yes, you've got 30 seconds or so to answer this. Yes, we use safety devices stroke apps. No, that we are considering using them. No, we do not use safety devices or apps. So I'll just give you a little bit of time just to answer that. While I do, and Steve, I'm sorry, I'm not picking on you when I come back with these questions in between. But there was, I guess, the question, I think you alluded to it in your response about how do you, again, it comes down to culture and engagement. How do you not sell? How do you? Someone's been asking, how do you make sure people wear these devices? Because there are people that are being cynical, or be like, you're trying to monitor me, or it's productivity. And I guess what you've just been saying is you're explaining to them why and how it's going to help. It's too big a question for you to answer quickly, but is that sort of just really engage again, that sort of safety culture?
Yeah, it is. And I think, I suppose to a degree like human nature, the people who see the value the most, the people who've just had an incident and have suffered it, they will endorse it fully. I think it is about trying to give a realistic picture without scaremongering of the types of situations that may be faced by that worker. Sharing even internal statistics around things like that can be helpful. But I think it's about just engaging with that person, saying, what would you do if you were in that situation? What's the implication of it? Where could that go? What could happen? And so I think it is about meaningful conversation, but it's very much about having it as an ongoing live topic. And that's why I think, like I said earlier, the customers that we see that have the highest usage in their solution are the people that are talking about it, not as a pointed, I need a meeting with you about that subject specifically. It's just part of their performance management process, as equally as their productivity stats or their number of visits they've done that day, or their mileage claims or whatever else it might be. That's just a part of that person's performance. So it just becomes the norm more than anything else. And it's just important to keep a dialogue going, I think, more than anything.
Yeah, sure, absolutely. So we get a lot of questions that people are saying about this experience that they've had as well. So I think it's important to answer. Right, let's see what people are thinking. There we go. So majority yes, 50% no, but we are considering no. About 30% no, saying they're not using safety devices or apps. Does that, does that ring? Are you surprised? Not surprised with these results?
I don't know. I'm not particularly surprised. I think people will do whatever they think they need to do, which is the right thing for their business. And it's you don't have to employ one solution or one situation or another. Training could be the right thing for your people based on your situation. What we tend to talk about quite a lot with people who inquire with us, as an example, is it can sometimes be that people feel, oh, that's going to be really an expensive, untenable situation for me to put a solution like that in. And so we will start with understanding what that individual businesses' requirements are. It can be that just by putting something in like apps, for instance, might be a good starting point. Some people use buddy systems. That might work for them, very, very small organizations. But I think what we would normally look at is, how reliable, how repeatable is that situation? Is it reliable from a buddy system if someone forgets to check in with that person? Whereas actually you put it in the hands of the individual, they can call for help if they need to. So it very much depends on a number of things, but budget doesn't have to be a barrier. but it's about finding the right thing for your people, and it's about a mixed solution. Some people might need, a dedicated device that they are using all the time. Other people might just need, an app that's there for occasional use when they are working, early morning only. My example of an office worker, first thing in the morning, just a couple of hours either side, that might be sufficient. So I think it's just about understanding the types of risks, and not everyone will need one particular type of solution.
Sure, thanks, guys. We're going to run over. I've been given permission that we can go for about 5 more minutes, if that's all right. Bridget, that's very kind of you. You've been able to stay on as well. So there are so many things I want to cover off as well. So we can do our best to squeeze in. But Bridget, one of the things I think is really important, again, to lean on your expertise is there's going to be future changes, future legal requirements that are going to around lone working, that particularly around the new government who are bringing in initiatives, and the Worker Protection Act, Martin's Law as well, which is a whole new webinar, I think. But I wonder what people can be doing to sort of prepare for these future legal requirements. Yeah, especially considering these new government initiatives. Can you give some quick tips?
Yeah, I mean, I'm not going to lie, it's a bit tricky when you're sort of, pre-elections, Labour coming in, you hear a lot of talk, but you don't have the details yet. So, companies are obliged to keep abreast of legislative changes. Again, the best source, in my opinion, is the HSE website. They will always let you know. You can sign up to newsletters and notifications for what's coming in. To point to a couple of changes that are coming in soon, you mentioned Martin's Law. So just very quickly, for those of you who don't know what it is, it's a law that was sponsored by the mother of one of the victims of the Manchester Arena bombing. And it's specifically terrorist related to really large spaces. So arenas, sports events, music concerts, shopping malls, etc. And it's designed to make sure that those companies that run those events and arenas are implementing proper safety measurements. So clear and safety security measures, bag checks, metal detectors, CCTV, all the things that you would expect them to do, but they don't necessarily do. So that's a piece of legislation that's coming in shortly, and is very specific to very large venues. Another one is updates to the Worker Protection Act. This is where employers are being asked to take proactive steps to protect their employees from harassment. Previously, under previous law, an employer might have vicarious liability if one of their own staff members harassed another staff member. This goes much further. This says actually employers are actively required to take steps to mitigate the risk of harassment to their staff from both their own staff and from third parties. So the practical implications of that is that businesses are going to have to start thinking about their harassment policies, their training, whether they've got sufficient de-escalation training and reporting mechanisms and processes in place for people who think they are being harassed. And then lastly, we touched on it earlier, but the Workers' Rights Bill. So I actually think it was being published today, the Labour's new pledge to improve employment rights in the first 100 days of their administration. I haven't had a chance to look at if it's been published or not yet, to be fair, but the detail is relatively loose, but all signs are pointing towards them really pushing the flexible working as a genuine default position for workers from day one. Which may see changes in legislation around the statutory reasons that employers have, for instance, to say no to flexible working requests. So watch this space, but what I suspect it might result in is seeing more and more lone workers, people working from home, working flexibly, and therefore, you having to consider as an employer, what the risks, what risk that entails, and make sure that you're taking steps to mitigate.
Steve, anything to add to Bridget's point?
No, I think Bridget's covered it all, really. I think like I said earlier, anything that's large event related, you can have a number of staff that are working quite sparsely, and they can still be lone workers. So every situation is unique, and it just needs you to be able to sort of stop and sit down and consider the situation that people will be walking into as well. So there's I think looking at those laws and looking at the future changes means that you can then start to try to get ahead and consider, well, what does that mean for me, my people? How does that change what we do?
Brilliant. That's great. Thanks, guys. I'm going to have to take a sort of chairman's point of view on this. I want to just, in terms of our question, now I've been monitoring these questions that have been coming in. I think a lot of them have been covered as well in some of in what we've been talking about here. But I'd also like to say I'd like to answer these questions offline as well, because we really are pushing to the limit. So Steve and Bridget, if okay with you, or perhaps we can have another conversation. We'll go through these questions and perhaps answer them on SHP as an editorial piece, because there's several articles in there in itself that I think would be really useful to follow up. So apologies that we couldn't get to them. We really did appreciate all of your questions. A lot of your queries have been answered, but don't fear, we will continue this offline as well to keep it going. It's obvious how much this is resonating with people, which is really important. So, but we'll just come up towards the end, and I'll just sort of hopefully touch on some of these key takeaways that you guys hopefully have been taken away. Again, the legal duty of care, how employers must conduct thorough risk assessments and ensure the safety of lone, remote and high risk workers. And the guys have touched on that really well in the presentation. Being proactive in risk management. So they're not just sort of ignoring and just thinking that's done. It's really taken a good cultural view at the assessments and putting some procedures in place. So regularly review and update risk assessments in order to stay compliant with evolving regulations and workplace complexities, which we touched on are getting as ever more complex and more extreme. Training communication is really important. Ongoing training is really critical for staff members. The use of technology as such is really important. A lot of questions about that as well. And I think that's going to play such an important part as technology develops as well. And it's how to implement that and how to incorporate it, which is really important. But ultimately, it helps support, reduce risk and improve worker well-being as well, as another topic we could really get into. But and again, preparing for future legislation. Ultimately, I know that you guys want to stay ahead by understanding these upcoming legal changes, which Bridget has really covered valiantly and brilliantly in this and what's coming up. So yes, that's unfortunately I have to draw to a close now, but I want to give my ultimate gratitude to my speakers. Bridget, thank you so much for joining us. It was great to have you on. I look forward to talking more offline about it. Thank you. Thank you. Absolute pleasure. And Steve as well. Great to have your input. Really like the interactivity and your clarity in sort of the implementation of this has been really important. I appreciate you coming on. Thank you.
Good. Absolute pleasure.
Thanks, Steve. So yeah, reluctantly, we have come to the end of today's session. Just again, like to say thanks to Bridget and Steve. As I said, if you want to listen back to this, I suggest you do. It's going to be a really good resource. This will be emailed to you within the next 48 hours or so. We're going to keep the conversation going with these questions that we haven't got around to answer. So keep an eye on SHP online. And do feel free also to share that on-demand link that you'll get sent with your colleagues. So we're coming to the end of our suite of webinars for autumn. We've got our last one in a couple of weeks' time. If you head to our webinar landing page, you'll be able to sign up for that. Remember, if you want to download your CPD certificate, you can. Make sure you do it before you log off. And most importantly, thanks for listening. Thanks for your patience, and we'll see you again soon. Take care.